Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Dershowitz, it's so great to see you again.
Good to see you. As you know, I'm on a train as we're doing this. My studio is Excella on the way to Boston to make some speeches to Chabad and the Harvard Jewish Law Students Association.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us from a train. It is pretty cool. We're going to be able to see a little bit of the United States as you're sitting there. All right, Professor, so let's get started. Like you said, you're on a train to Boston, so it's only appropriate that we open our show by discussing one of the biggest stories to hit the city in recent years. 4 years ago this week, Boston was literally rocked by an attack at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed and several hundred more were injured, leading the entire city to shut down for several days. What's not known is that a delegation of Israeli trauma experts immediately flew to the scene to aid the victims and build resiliency in the community. Tali Levanon is the head of the Israel Trauma Coalition, and she was in charge of that very delegation. Let's hear from her.
Shalom, my name is Tali Levanon. I'm the director of the Israel Trauma Coalition, an Israeli NGO, a partnership of 40 NGOs in Israel who work together for the last 16 years to provide care and training to communities who are affected and impacted by terror-related issues. We are working all over the country to work with individuals, communities, and cities in times of emergency and in times of routine. And unfortunately, we've gained a lot of experience. When we heard of the Boston Marathon bombing, we were horrified, like many other people all over the world. We had a short conversation with Barry Schrage from CJP, and within 2 weeks we were in Boston providing care and training for professionals who are working throughout the city. We worked with the nurses and doctors, we worked with social workers, we worked with the education system, we worked with spiritual caregivers, and it was a great privilege. We were told that the added value of Israelis, the added value we brought with us, is the fact that, first of all, we focus on creating stronger communities, that we focus on strength, and that we understand the issue of psychosocial preparedness. And this is what has been happening after Boston in many other places in the world. We cannot stop terrorism, but what we can do is create stronger communities, more resilient individuals, and more resilient teams. We can create preparedness in America, in Europe, and in other countries all over the world where terror strikes. We can be ready. I'm talking about psychosocial preparedness. My question is, what do you think it will take for cities in America, in Europe, in other places in the world to do something about terror, about being prepared, about creating resilience before terror strikes? We in Israel have received a lot of support over the years. We are very grateful, and it takes us out of being lonely and alone in doing what we do. And when time comes, we would like to support other communities and to do what we call in Israel tikkun olam. So when cities are doing something about it, we are more than willing to share our knowledge and experience.
Well, on behalf of Boston, where I lived for 50 years, I want to thank you, I want to thank Israel for the aid it provided during this terrible time of trauma and conflict. The world all stood strong with Boston. The only area where I disagree with is where you say we can't stop terrorism. We can't stop terrorism. We can stop terrorism by stop rewarding terrorists and stop rewarding terrorism. And what we've seen for the last 50 years is the world keeps rewarding terrorists. The world rewarded the PLO for its involvement in the killing of the Israeli athletes at Munich. The world rewarded the PLO when it murdered children at Ma'alot. If the world would stop rewarding terrorism, if the Palestinian Authority would stop naming soccer stadiums after terrorists and stop glorifying them, there will be terrorism because we will not stop rewarding terrorism. It's cynical, but we keep doing it. And I think what we have to do is make sure that every city is as prepared as Israel has been. And Israel can teach the world how to deal with terrorism and how to deal with trauma. And I think enormous appreciation to you and your team and everybody in Israel and all over the world who showed support for Boston Strong. And Boston came out of this thing, survived it. The surviving murderer is now in prison, facing the death penalty. His cases are still on appeal. We'll see what happens. But again, on behalf of Boston, thank you so much, Israel, and thank you so much, Israel Trauma, and thank you so much for the effort you made to help a city heal after the terrible trauma of the Boston Marathon bombing.
Now, Professor Dershowitz, we all know that you're a big opponent of capital punishment, yet in Boston, which is a very liberal community, the overwhelming majority is in favor of carrying out the death sentence for the convicted terrorist. How do you feel about this?
Well, I think it is a mistake to execute him. I think it's far better to let him suffer for the rest of his life in prison for the horrors that he inflicted on people. Look, a friend of ours, a friend of our family's granddaughter, was one of those who was very seriously injured. She was a dancer, and her legs were shattered. Amazingly, she was able to get back on her feet, literally, and go to college, and I think is completing college this year. There are so many stories of heroism that grew out of this, but the death penalty should not be a response to this. Israel has dealt with terrorism without the death penalty. Europe doesn't have the death penalty. The United States is really the only remaining Western democracy that imposes the death penalty. In Arkansas, they were trying to execute 7 people in the period of just a short number of days before the chemicals run out. It's barbaric, it's wrong, it's unnecessary. I will keep fighting for the abolition of the death penalty at the same time that I fight for very strong and harsh penalties for terrorists. And most important, that we never reward terrorists, we never glorify terrorists. We don't do what the Palestinian Authority does. Out of what side of its mouth it says it's condemning terrorism. At the other side of its mouth, it pays terrorists, it rewards terrorists, it lionizes them, it makes heroes out of them. We have to stop that.
All right, Professor, now turning to a totally different topic. Joining us now in the studio is Professor Avi Dreyfus from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum and Tel Aviv University. Holocaust Memorial Day, as you know, is just around the corner, and Professor Dreyfus, 70 years after the Holocaust, what do you think needs to be said today? What message do you think Professor Dershowitz should be trying to make himself?
So I will be the last one to tell Professor Dershowitz what to say, but I will say that I think that what we historians need to do is to continue to learn about the Holocaust, because until today there are many new documents we were not aware of, and there are many new questions that we're asking today which we were not asking in the past. And actually, even questions which were tackled in the past today are being tackled differently. And I think that we historians have to provide the knowledge, and then different people can have their opinions and say what they think should be done with this knowledge that we try to build more and more throughout the years.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree completely. Look, I keep learning about the Holocaust. My wife, my daughter, and I went to the small town in Poland, Pilsno, south of Rzeszów, and not too far away from Krakow, where my family came from, and we learned the terrible story of what happened to a beautiful 16-year-old cousin of ours who was used as a sex slave by Nazi soldiers and then murdered, and her younger brother who was taken to Auschwitz and served as a secretary and then was killed. So we learn this all the time. The other thing we can never allow to happen is the political exploitation of the Holocaust, which we're seeing in the United States. There's a group calling themselves the Anne Frank Center for whatever. You know, nobody has ever heard of it. Nobody knows who it is. It's a self-proclaimed organization. It has little or nothing to do with the legacy of Anne Frank, this wonderful young teenager who wrote so beautifully. And the director of it keeps exploiting the Holocaust for his own purposes. So, for example, when the White House spokesman made a mistake and he slipped and he said, look, even the Nazis didn't use chemicals. Obviously, he wasn't thinking. It was a silly thing. It was ahistorical. But he was not anti-Semitic. He was not a Holocaust denier. And this Anne Frank Center accused him of the worst kinds of abuses of the Holocaust. That itself was an abuse of the memory of the Holocaust. Or the Democratic National Committee used it as an opportunity to jump on their political opponents. We have to keep the Holocaust sacred and never allow it to be used for partisan purposes. Analogies to the Holocaust should not be permissible. The Holocaust was unique. It never happened before. It will never happen again, hopefully. The two most unique things about the Holocaust were, one, that it ingathered people from all over the world to bring them to Auschwitz and other places to murder them. There's never been a situation before where people were ingathered for murder. Other genocides involved just killing people on the way, people who were in their land. The Armenian genocide, what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Darfur. But the Holocaust was unique. Its goal was to find every Jew on the face of the earth, even in America, if they could reach them, and bring them to the places where the mass murders were occurring. And the second is the emphasis on children, on the genetics. Kill the children, because they're the ones who are capable of reproducing. The word genocide originated during the Holocaust, and it's unique, and we have to keep educating people in the world not to make analogies, not to say this is just like the Holocaust, or the Holocaust is just like, not to do comparativizations, oh, we suffered just as much. And so education has to continue, and I commend you. I commend Yad Vashem, I commend the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., I commend organizations like Facing History in Boston, which continue to teach the Holocaust and derive important lessons from the Holocaust. We must never, ever forget, and we must always remind the world of the uniqueness of this terrible tragedy from which the Jewish people almost did not recover. Thankfully, they did.
Now, speaking of comparisons between the Holocaust and other world events, we are seeing many people comparing the Holocaust to what's taking place in Syria. Do the Jewish people in the state of Israel, in both of your opinions, have more of an obligation to help Syrian refugees as a result of this? Professor Dreyfus, do you want to begin?
So I want to say a few things. First of all, even in the story that you told about your own family, you already raised some of the new issues that we tackle today in Holocaust studies. For example, what happened in rural places. Because for decades we talked about the big places, Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz, and other places, and only today we start to understand better what happened in the smaller places. So that is one important thing. Another important thing that you raised is the question of gender, because in the past, even we thought that there weren't any sexual contact between German and Jews because of what they had in their ideology. But today we know it's wrong, and even in this short, small family story, you can see how many new things we're learning every day and how our knowledge are being shaped. So this is one thing. Another thing is that I think that we as historians don't have other tools but comparison. And we all the time compare different things. We compare even things within the Holocaust. We compare different ghettos. We compare different camps. And of course, we compare the Holocaust to other things as well. And I think here we have to remember that the Holocaust was done by human being to other human beings. The question is, what is being done with those comparisons? Now, many times there is a usage of the Holocaust, and it can be taken to many different directions, and many different people within Israel and outside of Israel are trying to use the Holocaust to prove this or other status or position. And I think that here it's the researchers or historians' obligation to try to separate between the knowledge and what is being done with this knowledge. Now, regarding genocide, of course, today one of the questions which is being asked is how do you place, or where do you place the Holocaust within the genocide studies? Now, true, there were other people and other civilians who were slaughtered within the 20th centuries, and even today we are, of course, we know of human tragedies that are happening even now. But I think that there are a few things which were a little bit different in the Holocaust, and it's not that the Holocaust is different in all different dimensions. But if we're looking at the Holocaust, at the ideology, you brought the children an example, but the fact that it wasn't only murdering the Jews, but even destroying the Jewish spirit and anything connected to Judaism. It was actually putting the world fate on the fact that those Jews must disappear, and many other things which we cannot find in other genocide, terrible as they are. So I think that on one side, I think it's good that the Holocaust is still today some kind of a dangerous sign of what humanity can do to other people. On the other side, when everything is being compared to the Holocaust, it's also a problem, because the fact that something is not the Holocaust doesn't mean that that thing is not evil, is not awful, or anything else. It's not the Holocaust, but it still can be terrible.
I agree with you. 2 points. One on gender. Of course, the difference between the Holocaust and other genocides is in other genocides, women were raped and deliberately impregnated in order to have them basically give birth to children who were the seed of the enemy rapists. But in the Holocaust, there was no need or desire to bring more children into the world from Jewish women, so they were raped and then murdered. They were used as sex slaves. There's a great book, I'm sure you know of it, by Rabbi Oshry, who wrote a book about responsa during the Holocaust, and one of his most beautiful responsa is a woman comes back from the Shoah, and her husband sees on her arm a tattoo that said, basically, prostitute for the Reich. And he calls the rabbi and says, am I able to continue to have relations with her if she was a prostitute? And the rabbi, Rabbi Oshry, writes a brilliant, beautiful response saying she was not a prostitute. She was a rape victim, and you have to treat her with gentleness and kindness as a rape victim. And those who did survive the Holocaust as sex slaves were treated as victims, because that's what they were. In terms of Syria, I think we have to make very, very important distinctions. There are 3 points that have to be made about Syria. There is an international obligation to get innocent people out of harm's way. That's step one. Get them out of Syria. Get them out of those parts of Syria where they are subject to being killed as civilians. Getting them out. That's the first and most important thing. That's what Jews wanted to do in the 1940s. And of course, to its everlasting disgrace, the United States kept them out. Canada was even worse. But every country in the world virtually kept Jews out. So that meant they couldn't escape from the areas, Germany, Poland, etc., where they were subject to genocide. The second is giving them a place to stay in the meantime. And the third is giving them citizenship. And the 3 bear almost no relationship to each other. And we have to prioritize. And the priority is getting them out of harm's way. Second priority is giving them a place to stay, even if it's not a particularly comfortable or permanent place, until they can go back home. And the third is giving them citizenship. And that just is a non sequitur. There's no obligation to take in people permanently, whether by Europe or by the United States. Countries still have the right to determine who to make permanent citizens. And one shouldn't extrapolate from the need to get them out of Syria the need to make them full citizens of another country. They have to earn that right, and that's a very important distinction that has to be kept in mind. So again, we learn from the Holocaust, but it's never a one-to-one. The analogies are never one-to-one. And again, I want to congratulate you who are doing such important historical research and teaching us from the lessons that we all can learn from the Holocaust. So let's remember, and again, let's make sure that we as Jews and as relatives of survivors and non-survivors of the Holocaust never forget, as the Torah says, be kind to strangers because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Be kind to victims of genocide because we were victims of genocide as well.
Professor Dreyfus, do you have anything to say about Israel's role in dealing with the Syrian conflict?
I'll just say that I don't think that the Holocaust makes us more knowledgeable about other things, but I do think that it poses on us a responsibility for being better human beings, better Jews. Now, the question about Syria is a very complicated question because of all the political other connection which Israel has to Syria. And this is why I think this is a question which should be answered not by Holocaust researchers, but by others. And any answer of mine will be just like any other Israeli citizens who is traumatized of what is happening in Syria, just not far away from us, but still knows that things are not simple. If I'll go back to the Holocaust Holocaust itself, I think that really one of the things that we have to remember is that, first of all, knowing and learning more about the Holocaust really put on us some kind of responsibility to try and see what we can do with this knowledge. And this is a question that goes beyond history. Another thing that I want to mention is that many of the questions that we're asking here are not only questions of history, but also of commemoration. Because today we know that many of the things that Rabbi Oshry wrote were not really question responses as shoot that he was asked during the war, but more things that he thought should be put and said after the war itself. And I think that this can clarify the importance of wartime accounts as diaries and other documents written during the Holocaust throughout all Europe. And Jews wrote endlessly, young children, rabbis, women, men, in many different places. And of course, later on, gathering those many different testimonies, which those shooting, those responses of Oshry should be more looked as a second part, although we have quite a few shooting, quite a few rabbinical answers and ruling from the Holocaust itself, but that is, of course, a different issue.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the rewriting of history that we're seeing taking place. You know, last year I had the honor of attending the March of the Living in Poland alongside Professor Dershowitz. And as a young Jew myself, I worry about the fact that we're losing the last of the Holocaust survivors and the impact that that will have not only on my generation, but the next generation as well. Now, what is happening today in nations like Poland that seem to be rewriting their role in the history of the Holocaust, and what should we be focusing our research on in the future?
Okay, so first of all, we all are rewriting our history, as we should remember. But what is happening in Poland today is really troubling, because there is an attempt to have a new law which will limit the historical discourse and actually can accuse as a criminal act anybody who blames Poles or Poland in any kind of responsibility to harming the Jews during the Holocaust. Now, the problem is that we know by fact that there were too many cases in which Poles were involved in the murdering of the Jews or in other way of treating them badly. And actually, this new law, which of course Professor Dershowitz understands in the light of much more than I do, but it limits the ability of historians in Poland, and we have really maybe the most important researchers today of the Holocaust in Poland are Polish one, and this is something that is very troubling us from referring to those historians as well as to their students, because we are looking on those future generation and the atmosphere that is being established today.
Professor Dershowitz, what is your response?
Well, I agree. I think the Polish law is an absolute disgrace to history and to memory. And we have to remember the Polish people, like so many other people, included villains and included heroes. One of the greatest honors of my life was to get to know Jan Karski. Jan Karski was a young Catholic lawyer who went into the belly of the beast and documented what was going on in the death camps, and came to America and spoke to Felix Frankfurter, whose professorship I held for many years at Harvard, and described to Felix Frankfurter in detail what was going on. And to his everlasting disgrace, Justice Felix Frankfurter said to him, quote, "At a time like this, a man like me must be perfectly honest with a man like you. I cannot believe anything you're telling me." He refused to bring to the attention of President Roosevelt the account that Jan Karski honestly was giving him. We now learn, just recently, from documents released from the State Department, that, of course, the United States government was fully aware of the genocide years and years earlier. We also learned just this week from a discovery in the house of Anne Frank that some worker found some additional information. So every day, virtually, we find new information. Who knows whether there are any more Ringelblum diaries buried in milk cans somewhere in Poland. But there must never be laws prohibiting historical truths from being revealed. We know that in Poland there was complicity, tragically, by elements of the Catholic Church, primates of the Catholic Church, from Cardinal Glemp back to many of his predecessors, helped to inspire anti-Semitism as recently as just a couple of decades ago. And during the Holocaust, of course, there was complicity. There were also brave Catholics who fought against this kind of thing. And so it's a mixed picture, and the mixed picture has to be presented in its full and complete honesty. Historians must always let the chips fall where they may. Truth is the ultimate job of the historian. Emet, veritas, truth.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, and we have to wrap up our very interesting discussion. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz, and I also want to thank all of our guests. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.